Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our sixth webinar in the Telehealth series hosted by the Delaware Healthcare Commission. My name is Amanda White. I'm a senior consultant at HMA, and I've been providing support to this extremely informative webinar series. So today we're going to be discussing telehealth vendor and equipment selection. Our main speakers today are going to be David Bergman and Dr. Greg Vachon, who are both principal consultants at HMA. The first part of the webinar is going to be a review of the state's regulations, which include technology, site requirements, and emerging Medicare regulations. The second part is going to be an overview of the vendor and equipment selection process. And then the third part is going to be some use case examples. Before we get into the slides, just a friendly reminder that your phone should be muted during the presentation. But if you have any questions or comments throughout the webinar, please do feel free to go ahead and type them into the chat box. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this is just an overview slide that speaks to the origin of telehealth and how it aligns with BHI activities, addresses shortages with specialty care, and concerns identified through system transformation work. Next slide. Here's a disclosure statement that HMA does not endorse any specific vendors for telehealth or digital health platforms, though we do endorse the idea that telehealth is important and impactful in healthcare transformation. So for that reason, we do work with a number of companies in the digital health space. Next slide. Here's a list of all the webinars we've had in this series, and as you'll see, we only have one more left, and that one will be on use cases from the field. Next slide. This is our wonderful panel of HMAers who have been providing support and developing the content for this series, and we can go ahead and move to the next slide. David, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. So as Amanda mentioned, we have several things that we're going to be going over today. So we'll be reviewing the requirements in the Delaware state regulations around technology, the site requirements, and some of the emerging Medicare regulations. We're going to go through the selection process, and then we have a series of use cases, and then we'll open up the floor for some question and answer from the group. So next slide. And keep going. All right. So to start off with, we wanted to just create a common platform so everybody understands some of the basic terminology that we're using. And these are probably terms you're familiar with from some of the other webinars if you've been listening in on them. And I mention them here in part because they are important components of how you think about what kinds of tools you will ultimately use as part of your vendor selection process. So the distant site obviously is the location of where the provider is or the consulting provider. The originating site is where the patient is. So the site originates where the care is actually being delivered, and that care is always being delivered to the patient. So that's an easy way to think about it. A referring provider is the provider who has initially evaluated the patient and determined that they have a need for some additional support, whether that's through a specialist or through the distant or consulting provider. And conversely, the consulting provider is the provider that's delivering the care remotely to the patient, so via the telehealth system. And finally, the last piece is encryption. And encryption is important here because it's what protects the information that's flowing back and forth between the consultant provider and the referring provider. And all of that information has to be done at a fairly high security level. This is the data that's in transit that needs to be secured. And one of the common ways of doing this is through what's called SSL. It's the S in HTTPS, and it uses an encryption standard at typically at 256 bits. So it's a fairly complicated cipher that protects that information flowing back and forth. Next slide, please. The technology requirements in the state of Delaware really look at both the audio and the video components. And they're defined as the equipment that permits the two-way real-time interaction between the patient and the provider or the practitioner that's at the distant site. So the general description here is the secure video conferencing, which can be done via personal computers, tablets, or other mobile devices that all meet the requirements for telemedicine. Sometimes you'll see in other states that there are requirements around, for example, the resolution on the camera that's being used. Delaware doesn't specify anything, but obviously you should have sufficient resolution and bandwidth to support being able to view the patients. So in this case, a computer, like a laptop that has a standard camera and a microphone setup will meet the equipment requirements. You could also potentially connect via a smartphone with a smartphone application that would allow a provider to communicate directly with the patient. But there are some additional components of that, so it's not just connecting with the patient anywhere. And then finally, it's the real-time encrypted streaming through the use of some of these items. So there are telemedicine vendors that use more sophisticated tools, for example, that would allow a provider to pan, tilt, or zoom the camera lens as needed. Those are not required in Delaware, so it provides you with a lot more flexibility about using systems that are, in some cases, a little more streamlined, that will still allow you to bill for these services. Next slide. So for the site requirements, the distant site, i.e. where the provider is located, has to be a site that has been enrolled with the Delaware Medicaid program or with a Delaware Medicaid managed care organization. So it generally must be a U.S. facility, and it has to be in the continental U.S. And those distant sites are not eligible for what's called a facility fee. The originating site, i.e. where the patient is located, could include any of the same sites that are also distant sites so that they are enrolled in DMAP. But they could also include where the patient lives, or a day program, or an alternate location in which the member is physically present. All of those can be, well, not all of those, some of those can be used to generate what's called this facility fee. And the patient's home can be used if the communication is a HIPAA compliant and private. So you can't, you wouldn't be able to conduct a telemedicine visit while the patient is sitting in a bus, for example, because that's not a HIPAA compliant environment where the patient is. But if the patient is at home, you would be more than capable of doing it there. However, the patient's home is not considered a site for the purposes of originating a site fee. So the site fees you really think about are from medical facility to medical facility. But you can still do telehealth if it's from the patient's home. There's just no site fee that's associated with that. Next slide. There are some emerging Medicare rules so that are likely to be, they're sort of emerging on the horizon that are potentially important here. So again, we're looking at audio and video equipment that permits two-way real-time interactive communication. All of these systems would be capable of doing these things. And this secure video conferencing, these are all components that would serve some of these purposes. And again, this is the encrypted streaming via the use of the video camera, the audio equipment, and the monitor. Greg, I know you actually had some additional pieces here and wondered if you wanted to add a couple of components.
Well, I would just say that not only the Medicare rules, but California now coming out with a all plan letter. So that's Medicaid specifically, but will apply in California generally. And they're similar to these emerging Medicare rules. So in terms of the not much more in terms of requirements for specifics on the equipment, for instance.
Great. Well, thank you. Next slide.
All right, that's me. This is Greg Vachon. I'll go ahead and introduce myself. I'm a physician in internal medicine. I still am seeing patients. I'm in the Chicago office and see patients on the south side of Chicago and FQHC. I've at HMA done a lot of work over the years. I've been with HMA for 10 years in primary care delivery and that primary care inside of an integrated delivery system, specifically looking at IT and data components of that integration. And so, and as well, have founded a digital health company and worked with a number of companies in the digital health space. And throughout all of those, have had the opportunity to wrestle through this process of selecting vendors. A very small bit on equipment, it's same principles, but quite a bit in the vendor space. So I'm glad to be here and to share some of that with you. If you want to go to the next slide, that'd be great. This here gives us kind of a bird's eye view of the process of selecting either a vendor or equipment. And the first thing on there is really defining the business plan. That's critical. It's going to really flow into the next step and flow throughout. Without the business plan in place, you won't be able to do this. And we did here, there was a webinar which is referenced here at the bottom and is recorded, so you can listen to that from Uche and Mary Kate. I'm going to have some slides on some of the specifics in this flow, but let me just take you through the flow quickly and highlight some of these. So first is defining that business plan, and then you're identifying functions. You're going into your business plan and saying, okay, what are the functional things that we need to accomplish that will have to be performed by a vendor or that we need equipment for. You look out there and see what's there, identify choices, you make requirements. Okay, so these are very specific things. We have high-level functions, but requirements are very specific things. And we'll go over that in a subsequent slide. And then creating a vendor information sheet. So this is going to be a way for you to organize. Okay, I know what the functions are. I know the requirements. Now, how do they play out across a number of solutions for this, either equipment or vendor? And as you're gathering that information, you'll modify and refine the requirements. Oftentimes, as you're filling these out and getting the specifics from vendors, you find out things that indeed are important in the marketplace for your business, things that you didn't identify as requirements to begin with. So you modify those, or you may find out, and it's occasional, that you made a requirement that just really isn't available out there at a reasonable price, and that you're going to have to kind of dial back your requirements somewhat. So you're modifying and refining those. And then a useful process is scoring and weighting those. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but having a quantitative formal process for seeing where the different solutions, either equipment or vendor, fall out. And then if you need to, depending on your organization, bid it out, you do so, or hopefully more likely negotiate on the piece of equipment or the service that's going to be provided. And if you can, that kind of final step, oftentimes there's an opportunity to trial or pilot, not first choice for your from those who you're purchasing this from. Nonetheless, if you can get that, it's often good for you, but not always. Sometimes a trial or pilot period means that you have to put a lot of time and effort into that, and if you already know, hey, this is where we need to go, then that would not make sense. All right, if we can go to the next slide. For high-cost investments, before you even really get started down that road of selecting a piece of equipment or a vendor, and this readiness assessment example here is about equipment, but we have more content on the vendor side. But before you go in there, you're going to want to kind of do a readiness assessment. Are we ready to make this selection? And one of the first pieces, of course, is doing that business plan. But as you're really getting down to picking out the equipment or the vendor, you want to answer some questions for yourself to make sure you're ready. And what you see on the top right there are some particular around the space. If you're doing visits and you're going to buy some video equipment, do you actually have the space to perform those video visits? And if not, that's something to go to the drawing board first before you pick out your equipment. So we have more of these available, and you can let us know if you need this to do a readiness assessment before really going down that path. You can go to the next slide. If you listen to Mary Kate's and Uche's webinar on the business plan, you'll recognize this, and that's because for high cost investments, you need to bring together a team to create that business plan, and that's what Mary Kate was talking about. And also, for a high cost component of that business plan, if it includes getting an external vendor or buying equipment, you're going to want to bring together a team as well. And this is because, as you're making choices on the equipment, this really impacts workflow. So it's not only about, here's what we're going to do and with this vendor and have this piece of equipment. It's really, does the setup, how is that going to impact the clinic itself? So having the nurse clinic manager there to help give input and resolve that is very important. And then there's things like, that just important as getting the exact right equipment is having the coordination between, if you're doing a distant site, having coordination of having available the patient at the right time, the consulting provider at the right time, so having those scheduling systems match up. There's a lot of process issues that you're going to want to make sure are in place. A big team here, and as Mary Kate said, some of these roles, the team members, could be a single person. It could be that the telehealth program manager is the executive champion, but certainly bringing in clinicians, nurses, and medical assistant staff is important. Okay, and for both of these, I said high cost investment. So if we go to the next slide, it's important to have your effort in selection, be matching the costs of that equipment and vendor. And as I was alluding to, there's a lot more to it than the actual cost of the service or the equipment. And thinking about it in terms of this concept of total cost of ownership, which you'll hear about in a business plan or a startup or a vendor coming to you to offer some some service. What you want to know is how does this affect my operations in total? So there's obviously, you'll be looking at the purchase price, but and the costs of installing it, right? So those will be right up front. But there's also install time. How long will I need to be down? How much effort will I need to put of my staff into this, et cetera? Ongoing use fees, if they're per provider or if they're per event, it's important to map those out and know what those are. Training time, is there a cost for the training? Is there time that how much time, because there will be time, how much time is necessary for staff to do that training? What does the maintenance and repair look like? Is that included? Is upgrades included in the software if it is software? And then is there any extra bandwidth that you're going to need to install? Is it $150 instead of $50 to have the 1 gigabyte connection that you need for this piece of equipment, for instance? And then thinking about labor that it will take to do this above and beyond whatever the lowest cost alternative is. So there's the most efficient way of providing this with XYZ service. Now we're going to maybe use this other lower cost piece of equipment, but wait a second, we've got to count in the total cost of ownership that extra labor that it's going to take to have, for instance, a solution where we're going to have to manually input some of the data. So total cost of ownership, important to think about, and informs whether how much effort you're going to put into the selection process, and whether you're going to bring that whole big team, or whether you can really, have it more a concentrated effort. Okay, we can look to the next slide. And with that, I wanted to, further highlight that total cost of ownership piece with a visual. And what you're seeing here is a, let's say 79-cent bottle of water. It's relatively small. Looks like it may be a off-brand, but a relatively small, low-cost bottle of water. But we'll go to the next slide. Has other costs, other effects, other downstream problems that it causes. And what you're seeing here is out in the Pacific Ocean, a large swirl of garbage where kind of the stuff that we have run off into our streams and hit the Pacific Ocean eventually makes its way into the center here. And that cost of pollution is not counted in that 79 cents. And nor is the carbon to create the plastic, et cetera, et cetera. There's a bunch of costs in there, which is all to say that as you're doing your business plan, as you're thinking about your equipment or your vendor, think about all of the downstream costs that could be occurring from using that. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. So just a little deeper dive on that flow that we talked about up above, and right after business plan was these functions, and those are the things that the equipment or software is going to do. An example is providing a secure AV connection, right? That David talked about. So that might be the function of it, or to provide quick, reliable advice from specialists to the PCP, right? And that's an example of e-consults. We'll go more into that. But those are the high-level functions. Then you do a market scan, and that could just be, Google. It could be going to experts at advocacy organizations, and like those who are supporting this webinar. It could be your network, right? And it could be professional experts or consultants. But getting that market scan, what are all the choices out there? And then creating requirements. And these are really getting down to the specifics. And one of them might be encryption, which David talked about, and very specific. It might be, hey, this got to be 256-bit encryption. Or it might be something like, have features that allow for relationship building between the specialist and the PCP. You know, if you're talking about e-consult, that might be a specific requirement that you're looking for. Or you might get it even down to, hey, I want to see a photo as the way of helping to create that relationship, a photo of the PCP. So different ways and different specificity that you get the requirements. And it may be that different vendors will help create that relationship in different ways. So it may be that really the requirement is to create that. All right, we can go to the next slide. This is a sample sheet, the information sheet. That was kind of the next slide. You take those requirements, you get them into an information sheet. You look at a few different vendors or equipment suppliers or specific pieces of equipment, and figure out your total cost of ownership and what is the revenue that'll come straight out of your business plan. What is the expected revenue from that in using that vendor or using that piece of equipment, putting this whole thing into place, and then having some either categorical, like yes, no, or quantitative way of defining each one of these, so that you'll be able to do a scoring system for it at the end. And some of those scoring pieces, quantitative scoring pieces, might be the 1 to 5 Likert scale. And that's like the personalization of a consult, and you might ask across the group, how strong did you think this vendor was versus this vendor in that. It could be a specific number, like the minutes that it takes to do the data entry on the e-consult. So putting out the important things here. Some of them, are yes, no, because let's say you must have a behavioral health provider in pediatrics because of the practice that you're in, and that's really what you're getting this for, most importantly. And so that's just a yes, no, and if there's no, that's not the right vendor for you. So this is just an example of that, and we'll go to the next slide. These are some other things that you'll have on that sheet. So it's not, just 6 or 7 rows long, and it is information as well as scoring items. So those were the, having the scoring items at the top, but things that you'll want to know about each vendor, like what are their company characteristics, what other parts of the market are they serving, who are they serving, and their reference checks. Can they give you similar organizations and similar type of services for other places? Reporting capabilities, that might be scored out if it's an important piece to you. Supported devices, encryption, all those things that we've talked about before. At the end there, you see an important one, TCPA, meeting regulations, essentially. Meeting the regulations that David talked about in Delaware would be one that you would have on here. But other regs, and I'll go over TCPA as we get to the use cases. You can go to the next slide. So then the scoring sheet, it doesn't need to be perfect, right? You had an example there of the input across those 3 vendors. You give those weights. Having a team kind of coalesce around those weights will help you to build consensus in the team on what vendor or what piece of equipment is better, is the right one. And it will also help you in bidding if you need to do that. And hopefully you would not, but if you need to, then this is helpful. And then, as I said before, getting that trial period can certainly be helpful, but not worth it if it's going to take a lot of time and energy of the team, and you know what you need. All right, we'll go to the next slide, and this is where David and I are going to talk about some use cases that hopefully will further define the concepts that we've been talking about.
Great. Thanks, Greg. Next slide. So, to contextualize this, we thought, rather than talking in the abstract about, some of the regulations and policies, that it would be helpful to talk about how they impact things on a specific use case basis. So we've identified 4 use cases one that's looking at provider to patient, one that's looking at sort of provider to patient where the patient is at home, one that's provider to patient where the patient is in a medical office, provider to provider, and then a system to patient. So these are all different ways that you can be using these technologies to support improved care and care access for patients. So for this one in particular, you know, the provider has previously scheduled a telehealth appointment with the patient. So they have a specific time that's set up in order to conduct this meeting. And the provider sits down, you know, let's say it's in front of a computer in order to conduct this visit. So they call up the application, they dial the appropriate number for the patient. The patient most likely has some kind of a smartphone application that's connected with this platform, so they can receive the call. And part of what that does is it ensures that there is this encrypted communication that's transferring back and forth, so that, you know, somebody can't inadvertently or even deliberately spy in on what that conversation is like. And critically here, there should be some kind of a business associates agreement between your provider practice and the telehealth vendor. And what that does is it creates an effective legal construct for sharing the information. There's some ambiguity around this in the law, but the operating principle of most of these telemedicine companies is really around making sure that there is this appropriate legal framework in which to share all of this information. And so that's really why it's necessary to have a BAA that's signed and executed with your telehealth vendor. And then finally, in terms of the configuration of this specific platform, the Delaware regulations do require that these systems not be capable of saving the communication in a remote location. So there's another form of telehealth that's also known as store and forward, where a patient could either record a message or answer some responses on a questionnaire and have that saved and forwarded to a provider for evaluation. And in Delaware, though, that is not considered a valid form of telehealth or telemedicine. So it has to be this live, real-time, interactive communication between a provider and the patient. So, you know, the application that has all of these features would be appropriate for use in Delaware. The provider would initiate the session by calling up the patient would answer. And then the provider would continue to document all of the normal care delivery components within their existing electronic health record. And they would bill it as a normal visit, and that's how you would conduct this this particular telehealth appointment. And, you know, the patient could really be anywhere, as long as it's a private location that the patient feels comfortable having this conversation in. You know, it could potentially go to their, in this specific instance, it's going to their smartphone. So they could be sitting on the couch in their living room, holding up the phone in order to have this conversation. Next slide. The second instance that we've identified here is where a patient goes into a visit with a provider and physically, and the provider identifies that the patient has a need for getting some kind of outside counsel. And, you know, this could be an on-the-fly consultation, or it could actually be something that's scheduled where the patient comes back at another time to the initial provider's facility, their clinic, for the scheduled time, and the scheduled time would be made in arrangement with that third party provider. And it's really critical here that you're making sure operationally that all of the involved parties know what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. So there should be some kind of a shared appointment so that everybody can be informed about what's going to happen and where it's going to happen. And often for the initiating provider, there's a separate room where the telehealth visit can take place. So it could be an exam room where there's a laptop that's available to initiate the discussion. It could be, a separate room that has a door that can be closed. So all of the operations are all set up with this remote provider. The on-site provider would take the patient to this specific telehealth room and initiate the session with the remote provider and confirm the start of the session. And then, the telehealth application that the provider is using on both ends, both the distant and the current provider, the originating site, would have the same application and they could initiate it. Again, the application has all of those same features that we talked about. It's a desktop computer to a laptop computer in this instance. It's encrypted communication that's going back and forth. There's a signed executed BAA between the referring provider and the telehealth platform, and it has the save function that's disabled. And then, finally, the remote provider would deliver the care. They would document the delivery of that service in their own electronic health record. They would go ahead and bill for it as a normal visit. But the referring provider would also be able to bill a facility charge with a Q3014 and with a revenue center code that's attached to that. So they get some sort of compensation for hosting the patient when they're engaged in this initial telehealth visit. So those are two different ways of using these systems in order to support increased access for patients and improve quality of care. So Greg was going to take us through our next one.
All right, great. This use case is about a peer-to-peer, a provider-to-provider digital health interaction. And this is, of the area that David talked about, that asynchronous interaction. In other words, the time that the question, the consult, the referral is generated is different from, in time and place, from the answer back. So, obviously there's not a real-time video connection that needs to be made there, but, this is a important and growing solution for what is a real problem in a lot of populations and areas for getting the specialty opinion that's needed. So rural areas, specifically for uninsured or underinsured, certainly there's very difficult access issues in Medicaid in many states. So this is a way for providers to get that opinion, because an actual majority of specialty consultations can be answered and dealt with without having the patient actually physically be present, or the specialist and the patient to have an interaction. In other words, there's a question that the primary care provider has, and that might be about the workup given these kind of symptoms, or it might be, I've tried medication XYZ, what would you think is the next most appropriate, giving this patient's history, and that those can be well dealt with at a different, with this asynchronous process. So, and asynchronous, but there also may be back and forth communication. So it's not always, and as a matter of fact, a significant portion of the time there'll be a need for some back and forth. Oh yes, those tests. Well, I can't get that particular hemoglobin electrophoresis that you're looking for. Will this one work? So back and forth between the specialist and the primary care provider is part of this, but again, asynchronously. So the application features that one needs are somewhat less rigorous, but there's some choices there and ways to go about it. One is to have it fully integrated into the electronic medical record. So if it's within a system and everyone's using the same EMR, or if there's a opportunity for EMR to EMR, that putting the order in and the referral in one by the PCP can directly get that and have the result come back all within that same EMR. There's different ways to do that embeddedness. That's not the usual way that in these higher need populations and geographies and rural, that there's going to be a single EMR across the specialists and the primary care providers. There's generally going to be a lot of different EMRs, and so you need some other way of accomplishing that connection. One is with a web app that has integration into the EMRs, like either a single sign-on, so it's a button within the EMR, or a way to launch it and have that single sign-on process occur, so that it's easy for the physician or the staff who's ever entering that information to do so. So different choices there. One thing that is still being defined is the consent process in California, which is currently, as I said earlier, has that all provider letter going out to Medicaid plans and providers, that the consent at this point, although the final rules are not out, will be verbal. So, just like others, it's in the general consent to treat, and if there's a verbal consent process that occurs, that's fine. CMS still being defined. It was a point of contention on the first round of rules. We'll see what the final rules say, but there is a bill that would be generated from that consulting physician at the far end. And so, the patient, if they're responsible for 20% of the bill, Medicare, they're going to be like, oh, wait, I got another bill? They want to know about that. You want to know that there's a consent to that, because it will happen a lot faster than, deciding to actually show up at that specialist visit at some later date. It's great. It's a great thing, and lower cost and all that good stuff, and helps provide access. But you want to make sure the patient is ready for that. So billing, it's about to be included for Medicaid in California, and CMS is unbundling, meaning there's codes there before, they were existing, but now they're unbundled, so they're about to be able to be billed for. Okay, well, let's go to the last one here. And this is really talking about the quote-unquote system to the patient. So here we're talking about a health system or a health plan, but really kind of saying system, it means it's not from a particular person. That there are ways of using digital health to connect with patients, where at the one end of that interaction, there's not a person per se. There's some coders and configurers configuring software, but these are going out and automated. And it can be email or IVR, an interactive voice recognition, so a phone call with voice. But here specifically talking about text messages, which is a powerful way to set up a communication channel with patients or members, because text messages are open, they're ubiquitous, so everyone's using them. This has to be with the consent of the patient or member, or at their request, which a request, during the requesting process, there's a consent there as well. So either way, there's a consent for that communication channel to open up. Some of the application features that you would be looking for, one would be to have and we're really talking about this in terms of digital health solution as a automated messages, to be able to refine those, configure those so the right ones are going out, and they're going out to quote unquote like patients. So all diabetics that are 10 years after their last pneumococcal vaccination, that they get a message that they're due for that, for instance. Encryption at rest, as per expectations now. HIPAA is technology agnostic, but then there gets to be expectations across the industry, and they certainly need to meet those, and this would be one of them. But up to the point of the carrier. The text itself is unsecure on a phone, and so that's part of the reason that members need to understand and consent to that. But that carrier is transmitting the message, and just like the U.S. mail doesn't need to be a business associate or HIPAA compliant per se, it's just carrying that message. That's true for the carrier, and then making sure that within that application, that TCPA is really hardwired in. There's high fines there. You don't want to fall outside of those. Some of those are time of day, no messages after 8 or 9 p.m., no more than if it's a health message. There are 2 levels of consent. One level of consent in the healthcare environment is the person has given you their cell phone. That's the express consent. And with that, you can do exigent, or there's kind of a legal word for important. You can do exigent healthcare messages up to a certain amount of frequency. So 2 times per week, within those hours, you can send an exigent healthcare message. It's got to be important about their healthcare and not be any way seen as marketing. But if it's importantly about their healthcare, you can send TCPA compliant messages, just having gotten the cell number of that person. But all of that you want to be kind of hardwired in and structurally part of the application, so that you don't run afoul of those. And then making sure that there's good reporting capabilities on this. What is an automated function, and you need to know, okay, how many are going out, how often are they answered, how often is the action being taken, all of these things, so that you know that your return on investment is there. With that, I'll turn it back to you, David. I think we're just kind of going to Q&A, so we'll
Yep.
Open that up here.
Things up.
Yep.
Amanda, can we take folks off mute?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, so it looks like we got one question. It's around 12:20 if you want to actually look at it, but I'll read it out loud. So it says, where do we find the specs for the RPM codes 99453, 99454, 99457, as we are going to start billing Medicare and Medicaid for RPM next week? And again, it's around. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that that's a great question with a very specific and important answer related to billing and advice that sounds like needs to be nailed down, but don't have the answer to that right here. We could.
Yeah, the remote patient monitoring codes. I mean, this is sort of a new direction. And there are, some requirements for it about how long you're spending looking at some of these sort of metrics on a per patient basis. But yeah, I also don't have the specific answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, there's compliance. You're absolutely right, David. There's compliance issues there. Does your technology allow you to, circle back and confirm that you've done these? Similar to the chronic care management CCM codes, where there had to be at least 20 minutes of time, spent in that process in order to bill in any given month. There's quite a bit of layers to that, I would say.
Yep. All right. It looks like we got one other question about the use of FaceTime, and whether it's possible to use FaceTime for telehealth visits. And this goes back to the issue I had discussed earlier about signing a BAA, and there isn't a specific requirement that the conduit of information, i.e. the telehealth platform, sign a BAA. Apple, for example, does not make BAAs available. And you would also have to make sure that you're not storing the information in your iCloud. FaceTime does use encrypted communication, so that is possible. And if you do obtain patient consent should drive whatever you're doing. But as a general rule, there are very few telehealth applications that bill themselves as telehealth applications that don't make BAAs available to the providers that they're working with. So, I am not an attorney, so I'm not administering legal advice here as my caveat. So you would need to check this out with your counsel. I think as a general rule, you would be discouraged from using an application like FaceTime where the telecommunications vendor is not prepared to sign a BAA that includes you.
Yeah, I think you're right on, David. It's that BAA is a big deal.
Yep.
All right. Do we have any other questions for David and Greg? And you can unmute yourself if you want and ask it out loud if you want to, since we're at the end here. Going once. Going twice.
Well, great.
All right. Well, thank you, David and Greg. Any other last words before we wrap up here?
No, thank you. This is it's an exciting a time for these services. This, with new billing coming into place and really accelerating the marketplace. So it's a great time for it.
Yep.
Absolutely.
And please feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions or if there's any other way that we can be supportive.
All right. Thank you both. And thanks everyone for joining today's webinar. Just a quick reminder to please make sure that you fill out the evaluation survey. And just like David and Greg said, feel free to contact any of the speakers. And we hope to see you at the next webinar next Tuesday. Thank you.